In 1348, while the Black Death was ravaging Europe, a Benedictine monk named Brother Matthias discovered something that would make him more powerful than any king or pope of his time. He realized that desperate people would believe anything if you promised them salvation, and he was willing to use their faith, their bodies, and their souls to build his own twisted version of paradise on earth. What I'm about to tell you about his sacred order of divine love is so disturbing that the Catholic Church has kept the record sealed for over 600 years. This is the story of how one man used religious authority to seduce over 500 women, create his own religion, and nearly overthrow the established church, all while convincing his followers that sin was the path to salvation. Bavaria, 1348. The Black Death has killed 1/3 of Europe's population, and survivors are desperately seeking answers from God. In this chaos, a 28-year-old Benedictine monk named Matthias von Eisenberg sees an opportunity that will change his life forever. Matthias wasn't your typical monk. Born into minor nobility, he had joined the monastery not out of religious calling, but to escape debts and a scandal involving a merchant's daughter. But what made Matthias dangerous wasn't his lack of faith, it was his intelligence, his charisma, and his complete understanding of human psychology. While other monks preached about sin and damnation, Matthias preached about love and acceptance. While others demanded penance, he offered comfort. And while others spoke of suffering in this life for rewards in the next, Matthias promised paradise right here, right now, for those willing to follow his special interpretation of Christian doctrine. What you're about to discover isn't just the story of a corrupt monk. It's the blueprint for how charismatic leaders have manipulated religious authority for personal gain throughout history, a blueprint that's still being used today. Matthias's transformation from ordinary monk to religious manipulator began with a single realization. The Church's emphasis on celibacy and sin had created a population of sexually and emotionally starved believers, especially women. In medieval society, women had few rights, little education, and even less spiritual authority. They were told their bodies were sinful, their desires were evil, and their only path to salvation was through submission and suffering. Matthias saw this as the perfect vulnerability to exploit. His first target was Sister Agatha, a 24-year-old nun at the nearby convent of St. Clare. Agatha had joined the convent after her family couldn't afford a dowry for marriage, and she was struggling with what she believed were sinful thoughts about physical intimacy. When she came to Matthias for confession, he didn't offer the usual penance and condemnation. Instead, he told her something revolutionary. God created our bodies as temples of love, sister. To deny the flesh is to deny God's greatest gift. He explained that the Church's teachings about celibacy were misinterpretations of Scripture, and that true spiritual enlightenment could only be achieved through what he called sacred union, physical intimacy performed as a religious sacrament. But Matthias was clever. He didn't seduce Agatha immediately. Instead, he spent months building a theological framework for his teachings, citing obscure passages from the Song of Solomon, reinterpreting the relationship between Christ and the Church as a literal marriage, and creating elaborate rituals that gradually normalized physical contact during prayer sessions. The process was so gradual and so wrapped in religious language that Agatha genuinely believed she was achieving a higher form of spirituality. When Matthias finally convinced her to participate in what he called the sacrament of divine union, she was convinced it was God's will. But Agatha was just the beginning. Using her as a recruiter, Matthias began targeting other nuns, then lay women who came to the monastery for spiritual guidance. Each woman was told she was special, chosen by God for a higher purpose, and that the physical intimacy was a sacred secret that couldn't be shared with the unenlightened church authorities. Within 2 years, Matthias had seduced over 50 women, ranging from teenage novices to widows in their 60s. But he wasn't just collecting sexual partners, he was building an army of devoted followers who genuinely believed they were part of a divine mission. The genius of Matthias's system was its self-reinforcing nature. Each woman who joined was required to recruit others, and the act of recruitment made them more invested in the belief system. They couldn't admit they had been deceived without admitting they had deceived others, so instead they became even more fervent believers and recruiters. By 1350, Matthias had created what he called the Sacred Order of Divine Love, a secret religious movement that operated within and alongside the established church, but followed completely different rules. As Matthias's following grew, he needed to create a more sophisticated theological system to justify his actions and maintain control over his followers. What he developed was a complete inversion of traditional Christian doctrine that was so cleverly constructed it convinced even educated believers. The cornerstone of Matthias's theology was what he called the doctrine of sacred flesh. According to this teaching, the human body wasn't a source of sin. It was God's most perfect creation, and physical pleasure was actually a form of prayer. He taught that celibacy was a corruption introduced by power-hungry church officials who wanted to control believers by making them ashamed of their natural desires. But Matthias went further. He claimed that he had received direct revelations from God, revelations that contradicted church teaching and established him as a new prophet. According to these visions, the second coming of Christ wouldn't be a single person, but a community of believers who had achieved perfect spiritual and physical union. And the only way to join this community was through the sacraments that only Matthias could perform. The most important of these sacraments was divine consummation, a ritual that involved elaborate ceremonies, special robes, sacred oils, and ultimately, sexual intercourse with Matthias himself. But participants weren't told this was sex. They were told it was a mystical union that would transform their souls and guarantee their salvation. Matthias had also created a complex hierarchy within his order. New members were seekers, who participated in group prayers and meditation. After proving their devotion, they could become vessels, women who were chosen for private instruction with Matthias. The highest level was sacred brides, women who had undergone divine consummation and were considered married to God through Matthias as his earthly representative. But the most disturbing aspect of Matthias's system was how he handled the inevitable pregnancies. When his followers became pregnant, he convinced them that they were carrying divine children, souls specially chosen by God to be born into his new religious order. These children would be raised communally by the sacred brides and trained from birth to serve the order. By 1352, Matthias's compound hidden in the Bavarian forest housed over 200 women and 50 children. To the outside world, it appeared to be a reformed convent focused on charitable work and spiritual renewal. In reality, it was a carefully controlled environment where Matthias had absolute authority over every aspect of his followers' lives. The women worked to support the community through farming, crafts, and donations from wealthy supporters who believed they were funding legitimate religious work. They followed strict schedules of prayer, work, and spiritual instruction that kept them isolated from outside influences and completely dependent on Matthias for guidance. But Matthias's greatest achievement was psychological. He had convinced his followers that any doubts or negative feelings they experienced were actually tests from Satan, and that the only way to overcome these tests was through greater devotion to the order. This meant that the natural human responses to manipulation, doubt, fear, guilt, were reframed as spiritual challenges that proved the importance of Matthias's teachings. Women who tried to leave were told they were abandoning not just the community, but God himself. Those who expressed doubts were subjected to intensive spiritual counseling that involved isolation, fasting, and repeated sessions with Matthias until they recommitted to the order. And those who threatened to expose the truth were convinced that doing so would damn not only themselves, but their children and families as well. By 1354, Matthias had achieved something unprecedented in medieval Europe. He had created a completely autonomous religious community that operated outside church authority while maintaining the appearance of Orthodox Christianity. But his ambitions were much larger than a single compound in Bavaria. Matthias had begun sending his most trusted sacred brides to other regions as missionaries, with instructions to establish new chapters of the sacred order. These women, completely convinced of their divine mission, were incredibly effective recruiters. They appeared to be devout, knowledgeable religious women, offering spiritual guidance to other women struggling with the harsh realities of medieval life. Within 3 years, Matthias's network had spread to over 20 locations across the Holy Roman Empire, from Prague to Vienna to Munich. Each location was run by a sacred mother, one of Matthias's original followers, who had proven her absolute loyalty, and each location followed the same pattern. Attract vulnerable women with promises of spiritual fulfillment, gradually introduce them to the order's special teachings, and ultimately bring the most devoted to Bavaria for advanced instruction with Matthias himself. But Matthias's system had evolved beyond simple sexual exploitation. He had created what was essentially a medieval personality cult with sophisticated methods of psychological control that wouldn't be out of place in modern cult analysis. New recruits were subjected to what Matthias called purification processes, intensive periods of fasting, sleep deprivation, and constant religious instruction that broke down their psychological defenses and made them more susceptible to manipulation. They were encouraged to confess their deepest secrets and fears, which Matthias then used to maintain control over them. The order had its own calendar of religious festivals, its own interpretations of scripture, and its own system of rewards and punishments that operated completely independently of church authority. Members were given new names when they joined, wore distinctive clothing that set them apart from ordinary believers, and were taught that they were part of an elite group chosen by God for a special mission. But perhaps most importantly, Matthias had created an economic system that made his followers financially dependent on the order. Women who joined were required to donate their possessions to the community, and those who worked outside the compound turned over their earnings to support the order's mission. This meant that leaving wasn't just spiritually difficult, it was economically devastating. By 1355, church authorities were beginning to notice the growing influence of what they initially dismissed as a women's prayer movement. Reports were reaching Rome of unusual religious practices, of women abandoning their families to join mysterious convents, and of a charismatic monk who claimed to have received new revelations from God. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Matthias's operation. Church investigators discovered that he had seduced an estimated 500 women over 7 years, fathered at least 80 children, and accumulated wealth equivalent to several $1 million in modern currency. But more disturbing than the numbers was the psychological control he had achieved over his followers. When church authorities arrived to shut down the main compound, they found women who genuinely believed they were being persecuted for their faith. Many refused to leave voluntarily, and some had to be physically removed while screaming that they were being separated from God. The children, who had been raised from birth in the order's belief system, had no understanding of the outside world and were terrified of the demons who were destroying their paradise. But the most shocking discovery was Matthias's private journals, which revealed the calculated nature of his manipulation. He had kept detailed records of each woman's psychological vulnerabilities, sexual preferences, and family relationships. He had developed specific seduction techniques for different personality types, and had even created a training manual for his sacred mothers on how to identify and recruit new targets. The journals showed that Matthias felt no religious conviction whatsoever. To him, the entire operation was a sophisticated con game, and his followers were simply marks to be exploited for money, sex, and power. When the full scope of Matthias's deception was revealed, it created a crisis that reached the highest levels of the Catholic Church. This wasn't just a case of a corrupt monk. It was proof that the Church's own systems could be manipulated to create alternative religious movements that challenge papal authority. The trial of Matthias von Eisenberg became one of the most significant heresy trials of the 14th century, not just because of the crimes involved, but because of what it revealed about the vulnerability of religious institutions to charismatic manipulation. Matthias showed no remorse during his trial. In fact, he seemed to take pride in what he had accomplished. When asked how he could justify deceiving so many faithful women, he reportedly said, "I gave them what they truly wanted, to feel special, to feel loved, to feel chosen by God. The church offers them only guilt and suffering. Which of us was the better shepherd? This response horrified church authorities because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Matthias had succeeded precisely because he had identified real spiritual and emotional needs that the medieval church was failing to address. His followers weren't stupid or gullible. They were intelligent women seeking meaning and connection in a society that offered them few opportunities for either. The church's response was swift and brutal. Matthias was burned at the stake in 1356, and his sacred order was declared a heretical cult. But the authorities faced a dilemma with his followers. Many of the women genuinely believed they had been participating in legitimate religious activities, and punishing them would create martyrs and potentially inspire copycat movements. Instead, the church developed what became known as the Eisenberg Protocol, a systematic approach to deprogramming cult members that involved gradual re-education rather than punishment. The women were placed in legitimate convents where they received counseling from specially trained nuns who helped them understand how they had been manipulated. But the process was traumatic for many of Matthias's followers. Some never fully recovered from the realization that their spiritual experiences had been manufactured through psychological manipulation. Others refused to accept the truth and continued to believe in Matthias's teachings even after his death, creating underground networks that persisted for decades. The children presented an even greater challenge. Those who had been raised in the order had no understanding of conventional Christian doctrine or normal social relationships. Many struggled to integrate into regular society and required years of specialized care and education. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Matthias's methods had been so effective that several of his sacred mothers had begun creating their own splinter groups, using the techniques they had learned to manipulate new followers. The church was forced to conduct a continent-wide investigation to root out these secondary cults, a process that took over a decade to complete. The long-term impact of the Eisenberg case was profound. It led to major reforms in how the church trained and supervised its clergy, new protocols for investigating reports of unusual religious activities, and the development of theological guidelines for distinguishing between legitimate mystical experiences and psychological manipulation. But perhaps most importantly, it created a template that would be used by manipulative leaders for centuries to come. The combination of religious authority, sexual exploitation, and psychological control that Matthias perfected became the blueprint for countless cults and religious scams throughout history. Modern cult experts who have studied the Eisenberg case note that Matthias's techniques are virtually identical to those used by contemporary cult leaders. The gradual introduction of unconventional beliefs, the creation of an us versus them mentality, the use of sexual intimacy as a form of control, and the economic exploitation of followers. All of these elements can be found in modern religious movements that law enforcement agencies classify as dangerous cults. The story of Brother Matthias shows us how easily religious authority can be weaponized by those who understand human psychology and are willing to exploit people's deepest spiritual needs. But it also shows us the importance of critical thinking, even when dealing with matters of faith. The women who followed Matthias weren't weak or stupid. They were seeking genuine spiritual connection in a world that offered them few opportunities for personal fulfillment. Their tragedy wasn't that they believed in something greater than themselves, but that they trusted someone who used their faith against them. It's crucial to remember that the vast majority of religious leaders throughout history have been sincere in their beliefs and dedicated to helping their followers. But the Matthias case reminds us that we must always be vigilant against those who would use spiritual authority for personal gain. If this story has shocked you, wait until you discover the truth about the medieval queen who used trained spiders to eliminate her political enemies. Subscribe and hit the notification bell because this Friday, I'll reveal how one woman turned assassination into an art form, using methods so sophisticated that modern forensic scientists are still trying to understand how she did it. And if you want to know about other historical figures who used religious authority to manipulate their followers, leave a comment with false prophets, and I'll reveal the complete list of religious leaders throughout history who built their power on deception and exploitation. We'll see you Friday, when we discover that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who convince you they're your protector.